All right, let's dive in. This time we're taking a close look at Andrew Jackson's first term as president.
Yeah.
A term that, kind of kicked off with an inauguration that was pretty wild.
Oh, yeah.
Practically turned the White House into, well,
A mosh pit.
a mosh pit, pretty much.
You could say that.
And to really get into the thick of it,
Yeah.
we've got some really interesting excerpts from a historical podcast
If.
that digs deep into those first 4 years of Jackson's presidency.
Yeah.
By the time we're done with this deep dive,
Right.
you'll not only know what went down, but why it still matters, even today.
Ugh.
We're talking some serious political scheming, scandals that rocked society, and a showdown
Oh, yeah.
that almost ripped the nation apart.
Absolutely. And speaking of scandals, let's jump right into one that had everyone in Washington buzzing.
Okay.
The Petticoat Affair.
Oh, the drama. So Jackson picks his pal John Eaton to be Secretary of War,
Right.
which on the surface, like a pretty standard political move, right?
It does, but the thing is, Eaton's wife, Peggy, well, she wasn't exactly seen as acceptable by the Washington elite.
Okay, maybe outlaws is a bit strong,
Yeah.
but they definitely were fans. But the real drama kicks off
Yeah.
when the other cabinet wives, and we're talking the big names here, led by Vice President Calhoun's wife, straight up refused to hang out with Peggy.
Yeah.
I mean, can you imagine the awkwardness at those gatherings?
Oh, it went way beyond awkward. This whole thing really threw a wrench in Jackson's ability to govern.
Wow.
He couldn't get things done because everyone was so caught up in this social war.
It's interesting, though, how Jackson reacted. He was fiercely protective of Peggy. And I think it's worth digging a little deeper into that. His own wife, Rachel, had passed away recently, and she'd been through some brutal political attacks.
Exactly. Both Rachel and Peggy, they were both targeted, both accused of being unfit for their positions. Rachel, for her past marriage, and Peggy, well, being seen as someone trying to climb the social ladder who didn't quite fit in with Washington's strict rules.
So for Jackson, these attacks on Peggy were like a replay of what Rachel had to endure.
Absolutely, and he wasn't going to stand for it.
He couldn't let that happen again.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just about manners or gossip.
No.
It was about Jackson protecting someone he felt was being unfairly targeted, just like his beloved Rachel.
Right.
And it really shows how much personal experiences can shape a president's actions.
Oh, absolutely. And the Petticoat Affair, it really exposed these deeper anxieties that were bubbling under the surface about the changing roles of women in society and who actually held the power in this young nation.
It's so much bigger than just a gossip column, huh?
Oh, yeah, much bigger.
While the Petticoat Affair was revealing these social cracks, there was an economic storm brewing
Yeah.
that was about to threaten the very foundation of the nation, the Tariff of Abominations.
Okay, so imagine for a second you're a southern plantation owner
Right.
in 1829. You've got your land, your crops, your whole livelihood depends on it. And then, wham, this new tariff hits. Everything you need gets more expensive, and it's harder to sell your cotton overseas.
Ouch, that's got to sting. So tell me, what was it about this tariff of 1828 that made it so hated in the South?
Well, it was designed to protect northern industries, but the side effect was that imported goods became way more expensive for Southerners who relied on them. And it made it tougher for Southern planters to compete in the global cotton market.
So basically, the South felt like they were getting the raw end of the deal. And this is where John C. Calhoun Jackson's own vice president comes in with his idea of nullification.
I got it. Calhoun argued that states could essentially just ignore federal laws they thought were unconstitutional.
So if they didn't like a law, they could just pretend it didn't exist.
That was the idea, but it raised this massive question that had been simmering since the country's founding. Is the United States truly one indivisible nation, or is it more like a club where states can pick and choose which rules they want to follow?
That's a pretty fundamental question. You can see how this sets the stage for all those future conflicts over states' rights.
Oh, absolutely. And it's a debate that plays out spectacularly in the famous Hayne-Webster debate of 1830.
Ooh, tell me more.
Webster, arguing for the Union, delivers this line that is still quoted today.
Okay.
Liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable.
Wow, talk about drawing a line in the sand.
Right.
But where does Jackson stand on all this nullification business?
Yeah, this war hero from the South. What's he
Yeah.
going to do? Everyone's watching to see if he sides with his VP in the South or if he stands up for the Union.
So what happened? Did he spill the beans?
It all comes to a head at this Jefferson Day dinner in 1830. Imagine this. Washington's elite, all dressed to the nines, raising their glasses for toasts, and then Jackson, in this very deliberate act of defiance, toasts to the preservation of the Union.
Oh, that's a bold move. Directly challenging his own VP. What did Calhoun do?
He had to respond, right? So he gives this toast, suggesting that the Union is great as long as states' rights are respected.
Uh-oh. Sounds like things were getting tense between these two.
Yeah, you could say that. The irony is that Jackson, a Southern planter himself, actually believed in a strong federal government. He saw nullification as this direct threat to the nation's unity.
So not what folks expected from Old Hickory, huh?
Not at all, and it set off this whole chain reaction.
Oh.
Jackson started cleaning house in his cabinet, getting rid of anyone who sided with Calhoun. He even tried to appoint his ally, Martin Van Buren, to a diplomatic post, but the Senate, led by Calhoun, blocked it.
Wow, it's like a political chess match. So what happened next? Did this nullification thing just fade away?
Not quite. In 1832, South Carolina called Jackson's bluff.
Well.
They actually went ahead and nullified the tariffs and threatened to secede if the federal government tried to enforce them.
Well, hold on. They actually did it.
They did, and talk about high stakes. This was the closest the U.S. had come to a civil war at this point.
So what did Jackson do?
Oh, he didn't back down. Not one bit. He asked Congress for the power to use military force to collect those tariff revenues.
So we've got Jackson ready to send in the troops and South Carolina threatening to walk out. What happened next?
And then enters Henry Clay, the great compromiser, with a plan to gradually lower those tariffs, giving the South some relief while also upholding the idea of federal authority. It was a temporary fix, a Band-Aid on a much deeper wound.
Yeah, a Band-Aid. I bet Jackson knew this wasn't over. The root issues, slavery and the South's anxieties about their economy, those were still there, simmering under the surface.
Yeah, he knew it. But before we get into how those played out, let's switch gears and tackle another big battle from Jackson's first term, the Bank War.
Bank War. Sounds intense.
Oh, it was. But first, we need to talk about the Second Bank of the United States. This was an incredibly powerful institution. It controlled a huge chunk of the nation's finances. And guess who was a big supporter of the bank?
Let me guess, Henry Clay.
Bingo. It seems like every major showdown in Jackson's presidency has Henry Clay involved somehow. But remember, Jackson deeply distrusted banks.
He did.
And paper money. He saw them as tools for the elite to take advantage of the common man.
So he decided to go head-to-head with the bank.
Oh, he declared war on it. And in 1832, when the bank's charter was up for renewal, Jackson vetoed it. This wasn't just some economic policy move. It was a direct attack on Clay and everything he stood for.
I'm sensing a pattern here.
Yeah.
Jackson versus the establishment. But this veto, it wasn't just about politics, was it?
No, not at all. It raised some big questions about how power is balanced within the government.
Right.
Jackson argued that the president, not just the Supreme Court, had the power to decide whether a law was constitutional or not. And that sparked a debate about how much power the president should really have and what the limits of executive authority are. Questions that are still being debated today.
Wow, it's amazing to think that events from almost 200 years ago can still have such an impact on us today.
It is.
So in this one term, Jackson navigated social scandals, economic crises, almost a civil war, all while battling the most powerful financial institution in the country. That's a lot to pack into 4 years.
Yeah.
It
This
is.
is pretty incredible.
And that's not even the half of it.
Oh,
We haven't even touched on his second term yet.
okay, there's more.
So much more. Join us for part 2, where we'll dive into that, including Jackson's controversial policies towards Native American tribes and the lasting legacy of his presidency. It's going to be a wild ride.
All right, so last time we left off with Jackson, he had come out on top after battles with the elite, the banks, even his own VP.
Right.
But, as we know, things rarely stay quiet for long in American politics, right?
Absolutely. And Jackson's second term, well, it's no exception. In fact, we're about to dive into a chapter that is, well, it's considered one of the most controversial and tragic in his presidency, his policies toward Native American tribes. Yeah, this is where things get really complicated. I mean, on the one hand, Jackson was wildly popular. He was seen as this defender of the everyday person. But on the other hand, he pushed forward policies that had devastating consequences for Native Americans.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that even the most celebrated figures in history can have, well, a dark side.
So can you set the stage for us? By the 1830s, white settlers were pushing westward. They were hungry for land and resources.
Right.
And many of ththose lands were already home to tribes like the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole.
And these were tribes that had established societies, farms, towns, governments. The Cherokee, they even had their own written language and a constitution,
Oh.
modeled after the United States Constitution. They had treaties with the U.S. government that recognized their sovereignty.
Okay, so they had these agreements in place, but Jackson, along with a lot of white Southerners, they saw these treaties as obstacles,
Yeah.
right? They wanted that land, and they were willing to do whatever it took to get it.
Yeah, that's where the Indian Removal Act of 1830 comes in. This act gave Jackson the authority to negotiate treaties with tribes. The idea was to offer them land west of the Mississippi in exchange for their homelands.
On the surface, I guess it could sound like a fair trade, but I'm guessing it wasn't that straightforward.
You're right, it wasn't. The plan was to create an Indian territory, what's now Oklahoma.
Right.
It was supposed to be a place where tribes could live undisturbed. But many tribes saw it as being forced out of their homelands.
Yeah.
They argued that they had a right to stay, a right that was protected by those treaties.
And didn't the Supreme Court actually rule in favor of the Cherokee, like upholding their treaty rights?
They did. In the case of Worcester v. Georgia, the Supreme Court affirmed the Cherokee Nation's sovereignty. They said Georgia couldn't impose its laws on Cherokee land.
So, case closed, right? The highest court in the land had spoken.
Well, this is where Jackson's commitment to democracy gets a little fuzzy. He famously defied the Supreme Court. He supposedly said, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it."
Whoa, hold on. He's basically ignoring the highest court in the land. That's a pretty bold statement.
It is. It shows how far he was willing to go to get what he wanted, even if it meant bending the rules.
And I imagine this defiance had some pretty devastating consequences for the Cherokee.
Oh, absolutely. In 1838, the U.S. Army started the forced removal of the Cherokee Nation from their lands in Georgia, Tennessee, and Alabama.
Right.
Thousands of men, women, and children were driven from their homes. They were marched hundreds of miles in terrible conditions, often with little food or supplies.
This is the Trail of Tears, right?
Yeah.
One of the darkest chapters in American history.
It is. Thousands died along the way from disease, starvation, exposure. It's a horrific reminder of the human cost of westward expansion and the brutal treatment of Native Americans.
It's just incredibly sad and disturbing to think about. And to know that this happened even after the Supreme Court ruled in their favor, it just adds another layer of tragedy.
Yeah, it does. And the impact of Jackson's Indian removal policy is still felt today. Many Native American tribes are still fighting for their sovereignty and for the return of their ancestral lands.
It's a powerful reminder that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about real people and the lasting impact of the things that happened in the past. But Jackson's second term, it wasn't just about Indian removal, was it? He also faced some big economic challenges, right?
He did. Remember his fight against the Second Bank of the United States? Well, dismantling the National Bank, it had some unintended consequences.
Like what? Did it mess up the economy?
You could say it contributed to some problems. By getting rid of the National Bank, he basically created this void that was filled by smaller state-chartered banks.
So instead of one big bank, now there were tons of smaller ones? What was wrong with that?
Well, these smaller banks, they weren't as well regulated, and they started issuing way too much paper money. And that led to rapid speculation and inflation. Prices just skyrocketed.
Oh, wow. So things were getting out of control.
They were, and it all came crashing down in 1837. Just a year after Jackson left office.
Yeah.
The Panic of 1837, it was one of the worst economic depressions in U.S. history. Businesses went bankrupt, banks collapsed, unemployment soared.
So Jackson's crusade against the bank, it might have actually backfired and helped to create this massive economic crisis. That's quite a twist.
It is, and it shows how even policies that are made with good intentions can have consequences that nobody sees coming.
Yeah. It's true. So it seems like Jackson's legacy is this mix of, well, good and bad, progress and tragedy.
Yeah.
He expanded voting rights for white men, but it came at the expense of Native Americans. He fought against concentrated power, but sometimes he acted in ways that undermined the rule of law.
He's a fascinating and complex figure, really. He represents both the triumphs and the shortcomings of the time he lived in.
And his presidency really set the stage for many of the challenges and debates that would shape 19th century America. But before we wrap up our deep dive into Andrew Jackson's presidency, there's one more important thing we need to look at. His role in shaping the two-party system.
Yeah.
And the rise of the Democratic Party as we know it today.
Absolutely. That's coming up next. We'll explore how Jackson's brand of populism and his vision for America would have a lasting impact on the political landscape. Join us for the final part of our deep dive where we'll unpack the legacy of Old Hickory.
Well, we've covered so much in this deep dive, from social scandals and almost a civil war
Oh, yeah.
to forced removals and economic turmoil.
Mm.
It's clear Andrew Jackson's time as president was anything but dull.
Yeah, he definitely made an impact, that's for sure. Reshaped the whole political landscape in ways we still feel today.
And that's exactly what we're going to unpack in this last part, Jackson's part, in creating the two-party system as we know it today and the rise of the Democratic Party.
Right, so before Jackson came along, the political scene was a bit more, well, a bit more fluid. You had factions and alliances, sure, but not these sharply defined parties with their platforms and loyal followers like we see today.
So how did Jackson change all that?
Well, his rise to power really tapped into this surge of democratic enthusiasm. Remember that crazy inauguration we talked about?
Oh, yeah.
That image of Jackson as the people's champion, the one fighting against the elites, against the establishment. Well, that really resonated with a lot of people.
He was like the political rock star of his time.
Exactly. And his supporters, this diverse group of small farmers, urban workers, even some Southern planters, they rallied around him. They created these local political organizations, newspapers, even social clubs, all spreading Jackson's message, all working to get like-minded people elected.
So it was like a true grassroots movement building up from the ground level. But they needed a name, right?
They did. A banner to unite under. And that's how the Democratic Party came to be. Embracing ideas like limited government, individual liberty, and a deep suspicion of concentrated power, especially in the hands of banks and corporations.
Sounds familiar, right?
Yeah.
It echoes a lot of the themes we've talked about. Jackson's battles with the bank, his distrust of the elite.
Exactly. But of course, not everyone was thrilled with Jackson's vision. His opponents, people like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, they saw him as a dangerous, well, a demagogue. They were afraid of his populism, his willingness to challenge the norms.
So what do? Just sit back and watch as Jackson reshaped the country?
No way. They fought back. They created their own party, the Whig Party. They were all about a more active government, economic modernization, and a strong national bank.
So Jackson's presidency really sparked this political rivalry, this clash between two very different visions for America.
That's right. And that's how the two-party system we know today really took root out of the conflicts and divisions of the Jacksonian era.
It's pretty amazing to think that things that happened almost 200 years ago still shape our political landscape today.
It really is. It shows that history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding the forces that have shaped our world. By digging into Jackson's presidency, we've not only uncovered some fascinating stories, but we've gained some real insights into the tensions and questions that still shape American society today.
So as you go about your day, think about what you've learned. Do you see echoes of Jacksonian populism in our politics today? Is his legacy ultimately positive or negative? These are tough questions, not easy answers, but they're worth thinking about.
And that's what the deep dive is all about, giving you the knowledge and context to think critically and form your own informed opinions.
Well, thanks for joining us on this journey through Andrew Jackson's presidency. It's been a wild ride. Until next time, keep diving deep.